Hoopa, as they say. So that's where we're at, being that Paul, as we finished with the last study from Acts chapter 16, how he had traveled from Troas and entered upon Samothrace, the Greek island, and from there he sailed over into the Greece, and then came inland up into Philippi. Okay, so just like we had with Peter being Simon Simon Peter, we had Simon the tanner. Then Paul as well comes upon the woman that's from Thyatira, being that she was a seller of purple goods. And so as Paul was actually up in Philippi along with Silas and Timothy, they ended up arresting Paul and Silas and beat him with many rods. Okay, so at that point he was had lots of bruises, lots of stripes, very still in recovery, as we'll pick it up here in chapter 17. So and then they had discovered that he was a Roman citizen, which this put pressure and fear upon the city officials, because it was against the law to beat or arrest anyone that was a Roman citizen without having an appeal or a letter from Caesar himself. Okay, so as we pick it up here in chapter 17, the book of Acts. We're continuing on with Paul and Silas. Paul is still in recovery, but the mission must go on. So chapter 17, verse 1. Now, being that they had departed from Philippi, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Okay, and so in this area of Amphipolis, Paul would make reference here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26, being of dangerous rivers. And this would be a city that would be nestled right in the crevice of a river itself, being the Strymon River. Okay, it was a well-defensed city. You had the mountains to the north. You had this river that surrounded, so they had a really good, strong defensive city. This would have been one of the rivers that he would have had to cross that was in with danger there, being that he would travel from Philippi approximately about another 33 miles, and then from there into Apollonia, another 30 miles further there. Okay, and coming to Thessalonica. So there, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and so as they traveled, okay, in Philippians, it speaks about where the Philippians actually helped and assisted Paul to in these travels, and they only, no other churches actually assisted or gave any monetary gifts to help out. So, but also at the same time, Paul in Thessalonica, he worked night and day to provide his own way as well, so that he wouldn't be a burden to others. Okay. And so he comes into the synagogue of the Jews. Oftentimes you can consider that church next door, with a multitude of Gentiles or God-fearing Gentiles there as well. In verse 2, Paul went in as his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures. And so, being the scriptures at that time, as there was no New Testament, it would have been the Old Testament that he would be reasoning with them, explaining and proving. Okay, so, and oftentimes, you know, even in your seed planting, our seed planting, you can prove something, but it's not necessarily up to us to make that person to accept, and which is the case with the Thessalonians here. Proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few, meaning there was a good sizable number of the leading women. Okay. But the Jews, okay, specifically the ones that Paul talks about from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 16, I would encourage you to read that. They were jealous and taking some wicked men of the rabble. Okay. One other translation will call them the ruffians or of the marketplace. The King James mentions of the baser sort belonging to the market. Okay. So, and from this point on, we started to see no skateboarding signs appear in the city. Just making sure you're awake there. All right. But however, the Greek is the fact that belonging to the market. All right. And so these particular men of rabble, I can assure you they're not selling Girl Scout cookies on the corner. Okay. These are thugs, mobsters, those that are controlling the city's underworld. All right. And they formed a mob and set the city in uproar and attacked or assaulted the house of Jason, which would be most likely where the new church was formed, the new house church. Jason himself is also called one of Paul's kinsmen, perhaps a distant cousin from Romans chapter 16, verse 21. And this would be where Paul and Silas were staying, and seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men have turned the world upside down." Okay. So probably one of the greatest compliments you can give to Christianity. And so as much as when true Christianity is practiced, it does cause a revolution in your personal life as well as in the community. But also, I would make a note of Isaiah chapter 24, verse 1. It's God himself that will also take and turn that dish or to wipe clean the world upside down as well, from Isaiah chapter 24, verse 1. But in truth, it's actually right side up. Okay. And they've turned the world upside down and have come here too. And Jason has received them, and they are out acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus, basically raising the charge of high treason, similar to what they had accused Christ of doing from Luke chapter 23, verse 2. And the people and the city authorities, being the in the Greek, the polytarphus, if you say it really slow, polytarphes, add feathers, were disturbed, and when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let him go. And so basically what happened was the city officials couldn't find Paul and Silas, so they did the next best option, which was to take a bond or a security from Jason and them to give the assurance that they would not allow this to allow Paul to cause any more further trouble. Okay. And so that they had taken this sufficient amount of bail, and then after that, given the fact that if they did not return and cause problems, then they would most likely get that bail money back. But I wouldn't count on it. All right. But but verse 10, and so the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. Okay. just like when Christ had mentioned that whenever they persecute you in one town, flee to another, from Matthew chapter 10, verse 23. And so Berea, being that it would be 30 to 45 miles west of Thessalonica. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue, as Paul's custom would be. Okay. And so verse 11, we're going to have a Berean trivia here, a Berean pop quiz, okay, in this verse specifically, inasmuch as it says, now these, and in the King James it says Jews. However, Jews is not mentioned in the Greek, okay? So when it says now these, being that they were either Bereans or noblemen, okay? Now these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and they received the word with all eagerness, being that it was through the readiness of mind, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So, which is basically where we get the term Bereans from, being that these people set a really good example in being the model that was used for deeply studying for themselves, rather than just agreeing with the pastor and accepting what the pastor says without investigation here. Okay. And so many of them therefore believed, not with a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica, the same Jews mentioned in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 15, had learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea, also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. And so, modernized, you might say that they were bussing in mobs, and they were agitating and rising up, causing the crowds to be alarmed at what Paul and them were teaching there. And so then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea. All right. But Silas and Timothy remained there. In other words, he left them behind to essentially to consolidate the new church, to help establish and to teach as well. Now, it doesn't really say that he actually went to the sea and got on a boat and sailed off into Athens, okay? But that he went to the sea or along to the coast, it's unclear, and there's no mention of a ship. Most likely they were probably going to make a voyage down to Athens. However, they'll end up taking a route along the sea coast there, is most likely, okay? And so those that conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, basically making all of the arrangements. And being that Athens would be the capital of Greece, still is today. And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. And so he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. And some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers who conversed with him and said, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? And basically overtly mocking Paul, calling him a seed picker, in as much as like as a bird would hop around and gathering a seed here or a seed there, meaning that they were suggesting that Paul had bits of information gathered from multiple areas to piece together this ideology with a touch of loafer added to it. Okay. So, but others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, plural, or foreign in the Greek being demons or gods. And so because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So it may have been that they misunderstood Paul's teaching in as much as they had mentioned Christ or Jesus and the resurrection being Anastasia. They might have assumed that he was speaking about this God Jesus and the goddess Anastasia there, being that they had mentioned the plural gods there. So and so verse 19, and when they took him, they brought him to the Areopagus, being the court of the philosophers. And so also we get that from Ares, we get the Greek word, or the Greek there being the god of war, also symbolic for Mars there, which is why this is one of those chapters here in the King James. It'll mention that this is Paul teaching to Mars Hill there. But Latinized, it would be Mars Hill. And so they bring him to the court there of the philosophers, and they saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. And so not necessarily due to conviction, but rather to them, Paul was a philosophical oddity. And so they wish to entertain a new thought here. And let's entertain this thought, so to speak. Okay. And so verse 20, for you bring some strange things to our ears, and we wish to know wherefore what these things mean. And now all the Athenians and the foreigners who live there would spend their time in nothing else except for hearing and telling something new. Okay. And so the Epicureans essentially were a group of people. They were followers of the philosopher Epicurus, and which would basically define that they should that to have pleasure and enjoy pleasure is the highest good that you can attain. It was interesting as I was doing a little bit of digging on this. I found this really interesting, cool commercial from the 70s concerning Schlitz beer. And so they would, within that, they had a slogan that said, you only go around once in life, so grab all the gusto you can get. Okay, that was their slogan. So pretty much sums up the philosophy of the Epicureans. The Stoics, however, they were more in line with being humanitarians, that they had believed that doing good was the highest virtue you can obtain. And they were also pantheists, meaning that God was within nature itself, and that God could be explored scientifically, okay, and that God did not necessarily exist outside of nature. So you've got basically two different opposite ends of the spectrum. If you wanted to kind of, generalize the two groups here, you might say that generally speaking, the Epicureans would be more in line with like the good time Charlies, live it up, enjoy life. And then you've got the Stoics would be more in line, generally speaking, with the Puritans. All right. So the do-gooders out there and the tree huggers. Okay. So, verse 22. And so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, that's to say the court there, and said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious, okay, more so than others. For I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, and I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. Okay. And so Paul's not necessarily going to get into a deep Bible study with these guys, because they're obviously ate up from the floor up with idols and Greek philosophy and things of that nature. So, but he is going to use an object that he finds in the city, this altar, as a teaching tool. Okay. So one of the things that's very funny and comical about this specific unknown God and this altar, the backstory is that hundreds of years later or prior, that the city of Athens came under a devastating plague. And so they had consulted with the Oracle of Delphi. They all came to the agreement that they should hire or consult with the Greek poet Epimenides. And so he was brought in. His solution to stay off this plague was to bring in sheep and let them roam wherever they may roam throughout all of the city here of Athens, and then would have men follow after them. And each time a sheep or a lamb would lay down to rest, they would have the men to mark that specific spot, and then therefore erect an altar and to offer sacrifices, so that they would appease any so-called unknown God that they had actually perhaps offended. Okay, so that's where that comes in. And so visitors during Paul's day would see these altars to the unknown God there. Okay, and so Paul says, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands. Okay, inasmuch as that God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth, as it states in John chapter 4, verse 23 through 24. And as though he needed anything. And so there's one place in the book of Psalms chapter 50, that he would state that if I were hungry, I would not even tell you. But since he himself gives all to mankind, life and breath and everything, okay. Verse 26, and he made from one. Okay, again, you have to be able to put together a little bit of investigation here. All right, in the King James, it will mention that he made from one blood. Okay, in the ESV, it says from one man, and so forth. However, in the Greek manuscripts, those words man and blood are simply just not there. It's not in the oldest critical text of the manuscripts. All right. So you can also document this from the oldest complete New Testament Greek manuscripts that we have, being from the Codex Sinaiticus. All right. That was found in the 1800s at a monastery there. Okay, so you can actually go check it out online. It just says from one. Okay, so from one what? One source question. Okay, we know that God had created from one source, being that of dust, and also from his own image. Okay, but we know that it's not necessarily blood, as it mentions in the King James, nor is it from one man. as it mentions in the ESV. Why? Because if that were the case, there would be no such thing as Gentiles. All right, we would all be of the same race. All right, so it's important to do a little bit of investigation, especially in the sense of that he mentions he made from one every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted times and the boundaries of their dwelling place. And so I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the 6-day creation, where from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, he created the races, or he created mankind, and then he rested on the 7th, and then therefore on the 8th day, Adam was created here. Okay. And so, again, with investigating the languages, the fact that he had allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, the Masoretic text mentions the sons of Adam from what you would read from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. Okay. But also, you should also keep in the back of your mind from the Dead Sea Scrolls from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, that it specifically speaks about the boundaries that were put in, that the nations were governed by the sons of God, being the Ben Elohim, or the angelics. Okay. So that's probably a different study from a different time for a different time. But however, I would encourage you to check out the Greek words there, and specifically the Codex Sinaiticus from this verse here in verse 26. And so verse 27, and that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. It also states in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7, that for what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And then Paul's going to actually quote two prophets here. He's going to quote Epimenides, and he's also going to quote Articus of Cilicia. Being the first quote, Epimenides of Crete, he states, "In him we live and move and have our being." And as some of your own poets have said, and then he quotes Aratus of Cilicia, "For we are indeed his offspring." Okay. Therefore, or being then God's offspring, we ought to not think that the divine being is like of gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. Okay. And so that was one of the mistakes that Belteshazzar from Daniel chapter 5 had made, that he had threw on a big feast and was drinking wine out of the sacramental cups and worshiping and praising the gods of gold and so forth, silver. All right. But verse 30, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. And of course, that being the first step to salvation there, to acknowledge that you have fallen short and that you are in need of a savior. Because he has fixed the day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now, when they had heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." And so Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, and among whom also were uh, Dionys the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Okay, being that they were members of the court there. So I think we'll stop there with chapter 17 and pick it up with chapter 18 next study. So just to recap, Paul leaves from Philippi, travels down into Thessalonica after crossing over the dangerous river there, the Strymon River, and through Amphipolis and Ampolia. And so coming to Thessalonica, and then from there he would travel into Berea, which is where we get that term today, the model of a Christian student that wants to examine the scriptures daily to see whether those things are so. So we get that term Bereans there. Definitely a people that are noble and should be followed as far as their example in scriptures there. And then from there, coming to Athens, where it was ate up from the floor with idols, and he uses object lessons in the environment around him, the current events of the day, to basically push the gospel where he could. And so, you're always going to have those that are going to mock in the crowd, but it doesn't matter. So there will be some that will hear, and that's what it's really all about. So I hope you enjoyed that. And we're moving right along. Going to be in chapter 18 next week. We've already completed Paul's first journey, where he crossed over all the way up and through Galatia, Pamphylia, and so Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and now he's gone all the way across the Aetolian Plateau, which is to say through all the way through the middle of Turkey, and now he's traveled into the European soil where he's teaching here. So we will continue on, and again, hope you enjoyed it, and take care.